Pero le puedes sacar copia. Bueno, es que quieres todo.
Our next talk, we have a presentation by is it Paula Fomby.
Bueno, nos vemos.
And she's going to talk about PSID, as I know it, and especially she will talk about the child development study, which is we are quite interested on this child development supplement because
Thank you very much for the introduction and invitation, and thank you for organizing this event. I'm delighted to be here. Many years ago, as a graduate student, I was involved in data collection on family health and migration study nearby in San Luis. But my Spanish has only deteriorated since then, so I will not subject you to that. But I'm very glad to be here and to be thinking about longitudinal data collection in Mexico. So the purpose of this conversation is to describe the child development supplement that is embedded in the panel study of inmigrantes. So this is a really unique design in that it's a specialized study with a target population as a supplement to the longer-running, bigger study. And so there are some things that gave it some unique strengths, and there are also some unusual constraints in the study of this developmental strategy. So the panel study of income dynamics, as many of you may know, is a U.S. national sample that began with 5,000 families in 1968 for many of the reasons that we've heard about from Linda and Luis earlier today, particularly to understand poverty dynamics and to understand the risk of falling into and the mechanisms for moving out of poverty over the life course and over time. The study has persisted since 1968, and it has a genealogical design, which means that as children have grown up and moved into their own households, they have become sample members and have been followed themselves. And so we're now into studying children in even the 5th and 6th generations of their PSID families. So the active sample today has nearly 10,000 families and about 25,000 people observed in households. So those individuals I described who move into their own household units are called split-offs. Typically, this occurs when adults grow up and establish their own households. It also may happen when parents divorce and children move into separate households. And then we have a unique opportunity to follow the economic circumstances of children in their new households as well as their non-resident households, which is a really distinctive element of the study that's unusual for studying how family structure change affects children. The study includes an oversample of African Americans and low-income households. One cost to having a panel study like this is that, as we've heard, the sample becomes less representative over time as a result of immigration. And so in 1997, an immigrant refresher was added. About 500 families were added, half of whom were Latino and 21% Asian. And we have another immigrant refresher planned for 2017. To date, PSID has collected 38 waves of data from families over 47 years. It was an annual study up until 1997 and has been biannual or every other year since then. And one impressive facet of the study is that they do consistently achieve extremely high wave-to-wave response rates, usually above 90%. So this is just an illustration of the study design and the genealogical design that I mentioned. If you think about the couple at the top as the first generation of PSID householders, male head and a spouse, and think of them as having had 4 children. Each of those 4 children eventually becomes their own householder and becomes a PSID respondent themselves, and then they go on to have children who eventually become PSID respondents. And you can see that we have the data available on those solid lines to directly link people intergenerationally in their immediate families, but the dotted lines also indicate how individuals are related to extended families so that we can study how aunts, uncles, cousins in other households may be affecting the well-being of individuals living in a common household. So some of the research strengths of the design of the PSID are that it's longitudinal and it is multi-generational. And so one thing that this allows us to do is consider how individuals gain or lose economic, social, and personal resources like health over their lifetime. So there's an intra-generational benefit from longitudinal design like PSID. The multi-generational design allows us to see how and when resources like these are transferred from parents to children. And we can also consider the circumstances under which children may achieve greater social mobility or less social mobility than might have been anticipated as a result of shocks, as a result of their individual characteristics, as a result of policy change, and so on. And finally, we can look at how families contribute to social and economic inequality over time. There are many drivers of inequality, many structural drivers, changes of occupation structure, and so on. And we can ask, in the context of many drivers of changes in social inequality, to what extent do families uniquely contribute to that? So there are many benefits to using PSID for studying intergenerational mobility. But one thing that the core survey lacks is a great deal of information about children. So PSID can tell us a lot about social and economic mobility between generations once individuals are in adulthood. But it tells us less about what happens to children in families that shapes their adult outcomes. So in the PSID interview, we observe children, we know they're there, we know when they're born, we know who they're living with, we know when they move out, but we don't really know what kinds of interactions they're having with parents, we don't know what kind of school quality they're experiencing, we don't know what kinds of developmental challenges they're encountering that might shape their transition into adulthood. So this lack of information was one of the motivations for embedding a child development supplement in PSID. It would have been costly and very time-consuming to add questions about children into the core interview, which is already about 75 minutes in length. And child development studies typically require a different design, one that often requires face-to-face contact, and the PSID interview has been done mostly by telephone for at least 30 years now. So in response to all of these reasons to think about developing a child study, the first PSID child development supplement began in 1997. And the design was to include up to 2 children living in a PSID family unit who were between 0 and 12 years of age in that year. And so this is one of the interesting kinds of constraints. We just have the sample that we have. This is who's living in families at the time. We couldn't make this sample any bigger without bringing in other families to the study. So we ended up with about 3,600 children living in 2,400 PSID families. And this study had a cohort design with 3 rounds of data collection. That initial effort in 97, another effort 5 years later in 2002, and another effort 5 years after that in 2007. And again, the response rates were lower for this than they are for the core, but they were fairly high for a study of this nature. And so this is another illustration. If you think about the bottom row this time being children, children living in PSID households. The first box illustrates, on the bottom row, illustrates a family with 3 children, all of whom would have been age eligible, but one of those children was excluded because we were taking only 2 children from households. And then in the third box, you can see there are 2 children in a household, but only one is age eligible. The second child in gray is 13 years old. So we did not collect information on children who are adolescents when the study started. And then on the far side, we see a family member who has not yet had any children. And so that individual is not going to contribute any children to the design of CDS over his lifetime. So the design of the study in the field was that it was done in person as home visits, and we conducted interviews with a person identified as a child's primary caregiver and a secondary caregiver. Most often the primary caregiver was a mother and a secondary caregiver was a father, although sometimes it might have been a grandmother or another relative. And those those interviews were collected mostly by phone. And then we went into the field and conducted interviews in person with children and used an audio computer-assisted self-interview component for sensitive interview content with children who are 8 to 17 years old. A unique piece of the study was that we collected time diaries for children, and I'm happy to answer more questions about this. But this is essentially a 24-hour inventory of how children spend all of their time on one weekday and one weekend day. And these have been used to develop really rich and rigorous profiles of exactly how children spend their time, not stylized measures, but their actual time use. And I'll give you some examples of how those have been used in research to date. We also conducted a cognitive achievement test in reading and math with both the child and the primary caregiver, and we did anthropometric measurements of height and weight. And then we also were able to link, we knew which neighborhoods children were living in, and we got the school names so that we could link to contextual data about children's schools. Content of the questionnaire included some of the greatest hits from research on child development. So we have rich information on children's health and behavior from standard psychometric assessments, the cognitive achievement measures that I mentioned. We have a lot of information about what's happening interpersonally in the household in terms of family routines, discipline practices, family conflict. We get information from the caregivers about their attitudes about parenting. We find out about learning resources in the home, so access to a computer, to books, whether time watching television is limited. We have psychometric measures of the caregiver's mental health and self-esteem. We have information about children's experience of school and how involved their parents are in their education. We have stylized measures of children's time use to complement the time diaries. And then the older children, 12 to 17, reported on their family and school experiences, their social activities, their sexual activity, and drug and alcohol use, and other sensitive topics. So once these children reached age 17, they were no longer considered children, and as you might have calculated, the oldest children in the cohort, who were between 8 and 12 when the study began, were beyond childhood when this third wave of CDS occurred in 2007. So we developed another study called the Transition into Adulthood Study. And all children in the CDS cohort have eventually been absorbed into the Transition into Adulthood Study, which begins when children are 18. And so the reason that we developed this particular piece was that the traditional model for PSID was that children stayed in their households until they married and moved into a separate household in their early 20s, and we had a sort of seamless transition. What we see, and we were able to start collecting information on these young adults as they were going through critical stages because they were household heads. With the extension of the transition into adulthood, we saw children staying in their parents' households longer. They were not study respondents. And so a lot of things were happening. They were completing their education, they were beginning to work, they were forming unions and having children, but not necessarily setting up their own households. So transition into adulthood is meant to capture information directly from these young adults before they become household heads. And so we're observing these critical life stage transitions that they go through, such as finishing education, starting work, forming families, even before they're in their households. And so now they're interviewed every 2 years from 2005 to 2015. And so roughly we're capturing them when they're 18 to 27 years old. And the content of that interview largely overlaps with the child development supplement interview and the main adult interview, in addition to having some life stage specific items. And again, the wave response rates tend to be around 98%. So just to give you a rough idea of what this actually looks like in practice, if you imagine two children who are in the same family who showed up in CDS, the older child, born in 1988, would have been observed for the first time she was 9 years old. She was observed again in the second wave of CDS as a 14-year-old. And then she had aged into adulthood by the time CDS 3 occurred. So she was in the transition into adulthood study and observed 5 times between ages 19 and 27. Her younger brother was an infant in 1996 and was observed 3 times in CDS as a 1-year-old, a 6-year-old, and an 11-year-old, and then we didn't observe him again until he entered the transition development study as a 19-year-old. So you can see through this design, when we have a fairly wide age range for the cohort, it means that we end up having a variable number of observations on the children as a sample, and that we're seeing them at different developmental stages. So it's different from a cohort study, like the Millennium Cohort study, which picks up children come to a birth cohort at the same age every year. So some innovative research from CDS and the transition into adulthood study. First, I mentioned the time diaries. One of the most useful ways that the time diaries have been used is really just, as I said, to sort of inventory how children spend their days. Beyond that, the data have been used for looking at how time use at one point in time impacts outcomes at another point in time. So this piece by Hoper looks at children's home media use, their television, their computer use, and looks at their achievement and behaviors 5 years later when they're in adolescence. The time diaries have also been used to look at how parents' time overlaps with children's time. And so a recent piece by Shing and Feld looked at how children's time spent with mothers is related to their cognitive achievement, and particularly the time they spend engaged in educational and structured activities. So this again gets to a sort of life course and intergenerational perspective to how we think about the children's spending time. So these data are also useful, obviously, for longitudinal analysis. So just thinking about a longitudinal analysis of individuals, a recent piece by South and Lay looked at children, the time in the children's home leaving, and whether they ever returned to the parental home. So again, with cross-sectional data, it would be very hard to know if you see a child in their parents' home, if they've had a delayed leaving, if they've left, if they've come back for some reason. So this kind of longitudinal data allows the authors to track returns to the parent home and to find some really interesting triggers for returning to home, including the experience of physical violence and parents' poor health as causes of both delayed home leaving and home return for young adults. And then finally, when we pair CDS with a study which is embedded, PSID, there's real power for doing intergenerational analysis. And so for scholars of social mobility, the work that Patrick Sharkey has been doing is particularly innovative. This piece that I'm citing from the American Journal of Sociology shows that when a parent has grown up in a poor neighborhood, the cognitive ability of his child in the next generation is notable. But even if that child is growing up in a better off neighborhood, the intergenerational consequences of the parents' exposure to poverty has a lasting effect on child development. And then thinking more from a public health perspective, Elizabeth Vanderwater had a recent paper showing a pretty constant transmission of risk of smoking from parents to children over the past 45 years. So even though we've moved through very different paradigms of public health, thinking about the risk of smoking, there's a very persistent effect of parents smoking on children. So all of that has been done with data on children who have now aged into adulthood, and so what about the new generation of children? So PSID just launched 2014 Child Development Supplement, which has collected data on PSID children who were living in PSID families in 2013. And so we completed field work with a sample of children in April of this year, and we changed the design of the study a bit to include all children in families from age 0 to 17. And our goal by HRS is to move from a cohort model to a steady state model, where we're collecting data on all PSID children every 6 years. So in that steady state, in each wave we will add children who have been born since the previous wave, and we'll observe children 3 times. And this allows numerous cohort and period comparisons. The data in this study were collected not entirely in person. We did this by telephone, by mail, and in person. And so the interviews were done primarily by phone, and we had in-person sampling for half of families. And our eligible sample included about 58 children. Sorry to send up, I got these out of order. I just want to go back to this illustration I used earlier to show that this new design now means that we'll be including all children in households. So where there are 3 children in a household, we'll see them all. Where there are children who are teenagers, we'll see them. And anyone who's born after 2014 will eventually pick up the next one and see CDS. So some of the neat things about having a new wave of CDS include that about 1/4 of the children in this new study will have a parent who is a member of the original CDS. So now we have really rich child development data across 2 generations. Another is that we can now look at cohort differences in children who were born between 1985 and 1997 and compare those cohorts to children born more recently. I think perhaps most importantly is that CDS is unique in the United States. Right now there are no other nationally representative longitudinal studies of children. They're planned or underway. And obviously this complements other international child studies that Australia study and British studies that we've heard about. So as we heard from the census, the content that people are interested in changes over time. So one thing we're doing is looking to individual, and the ways we use the data we use also change over time. So in this wave of CDS, we're asking for permission to link to administrative records, including the birth records for children and their caregivers, and to the school records of children who are at least 8 years old, so we can have their state standardized test scores. For the first time, we're collecting saliva samples for subsequent genetic analysis. This is a really great design because we're getting this from the children and from their primary caregiver, which is somebody they're related to. So we're going to have 2 generations of information. And we also revised the questionnaire content. I think one of the most interesting pieces is that we included an extensive set of questions on computer and media use, about children's behavior with computers, television, all kinds of electronic devices, rules in their household, how much both they and their parents actually know about media and online activity. We also have updated the content we collect on drug and alcohol use, and we've added measures on children's social behavior in response to interest So the future developments for CDS include first and foremost that we'll be releasing these data next spring. We've also received support to launch a new transition into adulthood study for these children, so we can follow them as they enter adulthood. As I mentioned, there will be an immigrant refresher in 2016 and 2017, which is particularly important for studies with children because that's where problems with representativeness become most evident in the youngest segment of the population. We plan to conduct the next round of the Child Development Supplement in 2020. And our goal is to eventually collect saliva samples and genetic markers for the remainder of the studies including households that do not have children. So eventually have them all 25,000 active individuals. So you can get more information about the SID online and
solamente quería mencionar a mis colaboradores que los pueden ver aquí, que son
Thank you.
Gracias. We're going to take a few questions.
Thank you, Paula. Sorry, step up. We have some time for questions. Who says me? No? Yes.
You mentioned that they started Hispanic population was added in the second
It was added to the PSID in 1997.
1997. In terms of, let's say, representation, what percentage of the total sample for the 2015 more or less will be Hispanic?
Wow, that's a really good question. So what percentage of the actual PSID sample would be Hispanic? I don't have the I don't know the percentage off the top of my head. It's lower than what was the population representative because we have not included any immigrants who have been since 1997. So the sample, is this on? Can you hear me? No. Okay, sorry about that. So the question was about the representativeness of the Hispanic sample in PSID, and the Hispanics are underrepresented in PSID. It's representative up until 1997. So it's representative of families who entered the U.S. before 1997. The immigrant refresher plan for next year will bring it up to a more representative proportion.
We have time for another one. Well then, thank you very much. And our next speaker is Guillermina Jasso from New York University, and she will be talking about studying immigration. Sorry. The new immigrant survey. Guillermina, have.
Thank you very, very much. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. I have learned so much from all of you. This is an amazing collection of scholars in this room. I'm to talk about the new immigrant survey, and one of the very first things you're going to learn is that it's impossible to understand what's in the survey, what the survey is good for, how to use the survey, unless there's a good understanding of the immigration environment in the United States. Now, obviously, we're here to talk about longitudinal studies, so I'm going to do my best to skip over everything you really need to know if you're going to use the data in order to get to the parts that are really longitudinal study related. Yeah. I think everybody here knows that you can think of all foreign-born people in the U.S. as belonging in one of four categories. The importance of this for the new immigrant survey is that the new immigrant survey is a sample of people newly admitted to legal permanent residence. Okay? So that's one of those four groups that you see there. And this is just to show you what the numbers look like. Currently, about 1 million people a year get their green cards. There's, in the United States, basically 4-tier system. There's numerically unlimited visas, numerically limited visas, humanitarian, and legalization. And you see there more or less the numbers recently. So those are the pathways to getting the green card. Now, as also most of you here know, most immigrants in the U.S. require sponsors. So the minute we talk about the sponsor, we are incorporating a larger panorama of people who are vital actors in the migration process, even though they may not be migrants themselves. So the sponsor initiates the visa process. That visa process is arduous, stressful, can be extremely long, up to 23 years. And we don't have time unless you ask me, when does it ever go to 23 years? But I can certainly tell you. And because the green card is such a precious thing, and because there is restriction in the United States. There are large backlogs of people approved for a visa and waiting for it. And so what you see here is that right now there are over 4 million people who who have already been approved, but they won't get their green card for many years. This is from that set that is capped at about 366,000 a year. So with a little arithmetic, you can see that we already know, in part, who's going to get a green card in 10 years. Because they're already approved right now and they're waiting. And of course, what no one knows is where they are. And if they're in the U.S., are they in some legal status or not? No one knows about that. Okay, this is for the most recent year, the figures are available. This is the breakdown of new green card recipients. So you can see that persons from Mexico get by far the largest share of new green cards every year. And this has been going on for many years, and it will continue to do so based in part on that information that we have from those backlogs. Visa composition, I'm going to skip over that for now. Most green card recipients are women. That's a very